All paths of the Fellowship lead to one last great battle while Frodo, Sam, and Gollum continue to journey toward Mount Doom. This is my review of The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King. So this is my final review of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and if you guys haven't known, I reviewed The Fellowship of the Ring back in September, and I reviewed The Two Towers back in October. And the reason I'm reviewing the Lord of the Rings movies is because next month is the final Hobbit movie. And just in case you guys don't know this either, I think the Lord of the Rings trilogy is one of the best trilogies ever made in film history. And it's one of my personal favorites as well. So I can tell you right now that I think The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King is almost a perfect movie. The good points. The best thing about this movie, and I've been saying this for the past two movies, but the best thing is the directing by Peter Jackson. And every once in a while I wonder and imagine what the movie or the trilogy would look like if Peter Jackson didn't direct it himself. And obviously, for every director I thought of, I just thought of that director's style, and I just thought how different the franchise would have been. And after looking at this movie and the entire trilogy together, I can say that Peter Jackson was a perfect fit. Because like the other two movies, he brings this fantasy world on a grand and epic scale, and what stories to focus on more, because there are multiple stories going on throughout the movie. And speaking of the characters and the multiple stories, let's talk about the writing. In my opinion, most of the writing that was in Return of the King was better than the writing in The Fellowship of the Ring or The Two Towers. And I think that's because of the multiple storylines that were going on throughout the movie with all these different characters. And because of that, I thought it was smart how all the stories were intertwining and weaving throughout each other. Another thing about the writing is that it almost gets all the loose ends that were in the trilogy and wraps them up. The acting is another thing that elevated the movie, and is an aspect that elevated from the last two movies. Because there were two moments in the movie where I almost cried, and that was mainly due to the fact that the actors that were in those two scenes were given out their emotions, and because of that I was like, oh my god, whew. Another aspect of the movie that's probably the best out of the entire trilogy was the editing. Because like with the writing, it did a good job of intertwining all these multiple storylines together. And to me, it made a movie that's over 3 hours long feel shorter than 3 hours. Like the past two movies, I thought the score was done very well, just because it has that epic tone to it and that fantasy tone as well. And the score is what heightened these really sad scenes, or these really happy scenes, or these really mysterious or scary or oh my god scenes. Other aspects of the movie that I liked, but I'm not going to get into that much, were the cinematography, production design, costume design, makeup, visual effects, motion capture, sound design. Oh, and another thing I want to get into before I say my final good point is the original song called Into the West. Now, this song is probably one of my most favorite songs of all time because of the fact that it's the first thing we hear during the credits. Then when the final scene of the movie ends, it's like we don't want to believe that this trilogy has come to the end. But then when the song starts to play, you can feel oh my god, this trilogy is over. I'm just saying it had that effect on me. And besides that, when you just listen to it just for being a song, it's a really good song as well. With the vocals and the orchestra that's in the song. And the final good thing I'll say, but I'm not gonna really talk about it, but I will talk about it in the spoiler section, is the battle scene, because even though I don't think it's as good as Helm's Deep, I do think it's one of the best battle scenes in movie history. The bad points. Alright, so there are two things that I mainly didn't like about this movie, and I think I can talk about them since they don't really spoil the entire movie. One of those things was with Saruman's ending. Because his story wasn't really tied up, it's still a loose end in a way. Because the last time we saw Saruman was back in The Two Towers, and I know that in the extended editions that we get a scene with Saruman and Wormtongue when they're on top of the tower in Isengard. And I think that scene would have been good because it would have tied up his story and everything. And the other thing I need to talk about is with the Eagles. Yes, the Eagles make their comeback, and I still don't understand why they can't help the Fellowship get the ring to Mount Doom, because they're really close to Mount Doom when we see them in the movie. So every time I see this movie, I just keep thinking to myself, okay, why can't the Eagles help? And there's probably some explanation in the book, but Even if there is an explanation in the book, then why don't they say it in the movie? But if you guys know or have read the book and know why the eagles can't help, then comment down below. And the only reason this wasn't a main complaint in the Two Towers when I reviewed it, because in the Two Towers I gave it a perfect score. And the reason I didn't list that as a bad point was because there was no mention of the eagles. And since there was no mention of the eagles in the Two Towers, and when they made me focus on the story in the Two Towers, I was like, okay. But since they mentioned the eagles in this movie and had them really close to Mount Doom, it's like that bad point from the Fellowship of the Ring comes back into this movie. So my rating for The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, is going to be a 3.75 out of 4 stars. If you've seen the other two Lord of the Rings films and you want to see this one, then definitely see it. But if you're one of those people that haven't seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy yet, then I think you should definitely see it, especially if you're a fan of fantasy, adventure, drama. Alright, spoilers for The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. If you haven't seen this movie yet, then get out of here now, because I'm going to be talking about the battle scene that happens in this movie, and it's really epic, and you should experience that for yourself for sure. But I'm also going to be talking about some of the endings in this movie, and how some of these stories are going to be tied up. So like I said, if you haven't seen this movie yet, then please get out. Okay, so let's talk about the battle scene first. So, the battle for Minas Tirith, like I said before, I don't think it's as good as the Battle of Helm's Deep. But still, it's a tremendously done, well battle scene, and probably one of the best battle scenes in movie history, but like I said, not as good as Helm's Deep. So before the battle begins, a few days earlier, the orcs had taken over Osgiliath, I believe the city is called, which was the staging area at the river where the orc army was going to march from towards Minas Tirith. So now the day of the battle, we see that the orcs, like all these legions and tens of thousands of orcs, are marching towards the citadel. And there's just one shot, and it shows the entire scope of this army, but it's when, I can't remember who the character's name is, but I think it was when actor John Noble, I think that's the actor's name, was on the top level of Minas Tirith, and when he's looking down, like on the plains of Pelennor Fields, and he just sees this black mass throughout the fields. And when I saw that for the first time, I was like, holy crap, that is a lot of orcs. So anyways, the Battle of Minas Tirith begins, and all the trebuchets that are throughout all the levels of Minas Tirith are firing all these stones and pieces of debris out towards the fields at the armies of orcs. And there's a sweeping shot, like, on the field, like, you see all these pieces of debris, like, coming towards the orcs, and they, like, smash the orcs, they roll over the orcs, and some of them destroy some of the siege towers. But then the Nazgul come on the Wraiths, and they start to destroy the trebuchets that are in the city. And they start to attack all the soldiers of Gondor that are throughout the city as well. And back on the main level, we see the siege towers are getting closer and closer towards the wall of Minas Tirith. And the orcs are starting to pour through a little bit, like through the walls, but they're not really getting through. And then you hear all the orcs chanting Grom or something like that. And you see Gandalf staring into the distance at something, and it's like, why are you staring at Gandalf? And then when the next shot comes, it's this like giant, like, I don't know what you would call it, some sort of beast, probably the size of a normal house. And it looks like it's been all gouged out and everything, and has like fire inside of it that's coming out through its long mouth and its eye sockets. So that night comes, and the battering ram, which is the beast, is at the doorway, the gate of Minas Tirith. And the orc armies are also firing fireballs from catapults into the city. So Gandalf and a few hundred soldiers of Gondor get to the main courtyard of the gate area so that they can defend it. And then in this one shot, the battering ram Grom like goes through the middle of the gate, but it doesn't open the gate yet. And then you hear Gandalf saying, "You are soldiers of Gondor, no matter what comes through that gate, you'll stand your ground." And then when the battering ram hits again, the gates open, and there's this like line of armored trolls like charging towards the soldiers, and even Gandalf was like, oh my god, I guess I shouldn't have said that, because, yeah, I think I'm gonna run now. But anyways, these trolls are just laying waste to the soldiers in the courtyard. But then the soldiers fight back with volleys of arrows. And then they get their spears ready because the orcs are starting to charge through now. And now there's a battle happening at the courtyard. But then later on in the movie, we find out that the soldiers are retreating to the second level of the city because they've lost the first level. And while this is happening, you hear this horn in the distance, and it's the Rohirrim coming. And as Theoden sees the sight of the battle, he's like, oh my god, because then we get sort of a POV shot in a way of like his view, and we see just still like thousands and thousands of orcs just still walking towards the city still. Then Theoden goes down the line of Rohirrim, just giving his speech to rally up his Rohirrim. And then he says, "For Thurlengus!" And the horns start to blow, and the 6,000 or so cavalry of Rohirrim start to charge towards these tens of thousands of orcs. And the orcs start to get ready by having this line of spears ready, and in the back they have archers that are starting to fire into the Rohirrim. But barely any of the Rohirrim are going down, like there's a few of them going down, but not all of them. And then one of the orc leaders is looking at the distance, seeing that the Rohirrim are still charging, and he's like, uh-oh, I guess I'm gonna get out of here. And you see all the other orcs are like, oh my god, they're still charging at us, like, oh my god, we gotta run. And the Rohirrim just like plows through all the orcs, and are just charging through all of them towards the other end of the plain. And the orcs are actually starting to retreat, and one of the soldiers in the Rohirrim were like, drive them to the river! And then Theoden is like, make safe the city! And then as the Rohirrim start to move towards the retreating orcs, the Rohirrim stops, and there's this close-up of Theoden's face, and you hear these, like, sort of weird beats in the background, like drums are being beaten or something, and you don't know what it is, because you just see Theoden's face, like, go from a smile into, like, a frown in a way. And then you see what he's looking at, and it's a line of 20 or so elephants, like, going towards the city. And this is another part of the movie where, when I saw it for the first time, like me and the entire audience that I saw it with was like, oh my god. And it seems like Theoden didn't know what to do at that moment, and probably I wouldn't have either. But then he decides the only choice that they had was to charge at the elephants. And that's what they do, like the Rohirrim charges at the elephants, and then like when they start to get closer and closer, one of the elephants' heads starts to like swing, and then it's like it swings back normally, and then it just like swipes like part of the Rohirrim out, and like has a few dozen horses and people fly in the air. And basically for the next few minutes it looks like that the forces of Sauron have the upper hand, and looks like they're gonna win the battle. But then in the distance, at this docking area, it seems like a group of orcs are waiting for the pirates to come to help with the battle. But little do they know, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and the Ghost are there, and when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli get out, they're a little bit shocked. And then as we see Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli starting to run towards the group of orcs, we see that the Ghosts are coming through the ships and are starting to run with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli towards the orcs. And from that moment on, that was the downfall of the battle for Sauron's army. But probably another great moment from this movie was when Legolas, Aragorn, Gimli, and the Ghost were then on Pelennor Fields, and then an elephant was coming towards Legolas, and then Legolas was like, okay, I can take you on. He runs towards it, gets on top of that tower on the back of the elephant, cuts the ropes off so that the tower falls on the ground, runs towards the elephant's head, gets 3 arrows from his sheath, pulls back his bow and arrow, and like shoots him into the elephant's head. Then the elephant goes down, and Legolas runs down the head of the elephant, then slides down his trunk, does like a little hop at the end of the trunk, and is just there as Gimli is there as well, and then Legolas is like, and then Gimli is just like this, and then he says, that still just counts as 1, because they're having this game as to who could kill the most. But anyway, so yeah, the forces of Sauron lose the Battle of Minas Tirith because of the Ghost, basically. Alright, let's get into the endings of the movie. So, a lot of people have a complaint about The Return of the King because of the multiple endings that it had, but I found it to be alright since it tied up all the loose ends of the movie, and of the trilogy. Well, most of them anyway. So basically what happens at the ending is that Aragorn is at his coronation as the king, and then he finds out that Arwen is there, and then they hug and kiss each other. Then Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin bow to Aragorn, and Aragorn's like, no, you bow down to no one. And then you see all the humans around them, and all the elves bowing down to the 4 hobbits, and that was a really cool scene. And then Frodo does a monologue as to what happened to the Fellowship and that they were returning home. And we see them coming home, and then we see them at the bar, and they're like, yep, I guess it's over. Then Sam looks over at the girl barkeeper, which is the girl that she was afraid of and was shy around. And then he goes up to her while Frodo, Merry, and Pippin are laughing. And in the next shot, we find out that Sam and the girl get married. And then in the next scene, Frodo is at his home, and Sam is with him. And Frodo is writing a book called The Lord of the Rings. And Frodo is like, I still feel it while touching his chest, and that's the place where the Nazgul blade stabbed him. And I believe he says something to the effect of, like, I feel different or something like that. And in the next scene, we see some horses and a wagon going out of the Shire, it looks like. And in the wagon, we see a really old Bilbo. And that showed us the power that the ring had, because the ring was giving him youth. But now that the ring was destroyed, he doesn't have that, like, sort of power now. And now time has caught up with him. Now the horses and the wagon go to the Grey Havens, which is this dock. And that one elf played by Hugo Weaving was there, and he was telling Bilbo that the lands call to us or something. And Bilbo's like, I am ready for one more adventure. And he goes on a ship where the elves are getting onto, and the ship that Gandalf is going to get onto, because his mission is over with. And I was starting to tear up because of Gandalf leaving. It's like, no, Gandalf, please stay. And then Gandalf was leaving, but then he turns around and says, are you coming too, Frodo? And then Sam, Merry, Pippin are confused, and I was confused because they're like, wait, what? And I understand that he had to go because of the fact that he didn't feel like himself anymore. And that the place the elves are going to are called Dinelands, and he'll feel much better there. But it was just really sad knowing that Frodo was going, and I was crying during this scene. Frodo was crying a little bit while Sam, Merry, and Pippin are crying a lot while they're hugging Frodo, saying their goodbyes. And then Frodo and Gandalf get on the ship, and the ship starts to leave the dock, and it looks like Sam, Merry, Pippin are starting to walk away, but then Sam takes one last look back at the ship as the ship leaves the docking area towards the sea, and then the screen goes white, and then we see Sam back in the Shire, and he goes to his home where his wife and his 2 kids are. He looks around, and he's like, I'm back. And then he goes in to his home with his family. Door closes, goes to black, and then the end. And it's like, ah, man. So that was my review of The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Hope you guys liked it, and other than that, guys, that's it.